As mentioned in the introduction, this paper will present the initial stages of my doctoral research into the personal archive and research notes of Slovakian neo-avant-garde artist Julius Koller. This research will fully commence in autumn 2018, so I haven't started yet, really. So therefore, rather than presenting any particular outcomes, this paper will focus on the primary methodological motivations behind researching private personal archive of an East Central European artist of the pre-1989 era. And I will be looking especially at the part of the archive that is today in the collection of Slovak National Gallery in Bratislava. Part of the academic aims of my research will be to contribute to the current tendencies of questioning and the interpretation and reinterpretation of the currently dominant narratives concerning the theory of avant-garde. And since I'm only at the very beginning of my academic career, I will be most grateful for any feedback or comments to help kickstart my research in the right direction. So first, I would like to talk about the main problems that we face at art historians studying the East European neo-avant-garde art, and that is to find the right way around the centralized tendencies of established scholarship dealing with the theory of avant-gardes that follow from the traditions of Western Marxist and post-Marxist writing on art. This has developed over the course of the 20th century, mainly as a critical method to study the conventional modes of artistic production and consumption under capitalism. However, the fall of the Iron Curtain and the gradual rediscovery of avant-garde art under communism brought with it the question, what about art produced in the environment where socialism was not powerful only as the base for theoretical discourse, but its dominance was based on actualized political reality that affected not only all public matters, but also had an immediate impact on everyday lives of individual citizens? This is the question that we all ask, and we all try to find the most appropriate way to address this problem. And in this paper, I would like to talk about my points of departure and some theories I have been thinking about in preparation for my research. And I believe that Julius Koller will make an appropriate case study. I am starting from the assumption, and one of my hopes is to research this a little bit more in depth during my project. So I'm starting from the assumption that both Western and Eastern avant-garde suffer from a trauma caused by their respective socio-political environments. A lot has been written about the Western avant-garde in this respect, about the trauma created by the rise of bourgeoisie and the capitalist society where art got dissociated from its function in everyday life and became a mere commodity. Subsequently, in historical avant-gardes, neo-avant-gardes, and also in many forms of contemporary art, we can observe the recurring attempts of art to deal with this trauma and to reconcile with life, basically to find its function in everyday life, although often unsuccessfully. This is the trauma that appears on the institutional level. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, we have trauma encountered by the East European art, again the trauma resulting from the political environment. However, the difference is that this trauma created by the communism appears on the existential level. Let's call it the collective trauma of the lost self. This is the trauma that appears because the communist regime as a form of totalitarian sovereignty appears or operates directly on people's lives. Because of the vast apparatus of regulations and complex system of surveillance and observation, which results in the environment that suppresses the individual self and the uniqueness of personality, because of the panopticized nature of the public sphere. And in such environment, individual identity suffers for the good of collective identity. In short, people suffer from the impossibility to express the true self in the public sphere. Consequently, there are two traumas, both resulting from their respective political environments, one appearing on the institutional level and the other appearing on the existential level. Naturally, they are both tackled on the very same fronts where they appear. Western art tackles political establishment on the institutional level by challenging and transforming the established norms of politics and institutions, including art itself as an institution. East European art turns inwards to the individual, tackling the trauma on the existential level through the means of transformation of life. These are all known facts that are not really new. This is where the current theoretical framework sits when dealing with the Western or Eastern art respectively. And today we face the questions of how to bring the two together. because we don't want to leave the neo-avant-garde of Eastern Europe separated in a box, fenced off on one side by the political divide of the Cold War era, and on the other, again, by the political divide of the 1989. So how do we overcome this East-West divide and the pre- and post-1989 divide? Or should we actually overcome these divides at all? Recently, I've read a new book by Amy Briscoe called The Performance Art in Eastern Europe since 1960. It is a very thought-provoking reading, and it made me ask a lot of questions, particularly about this East-West and before-after divide. In the introduction, she says the ambition of the book, which is to disrupt the East-West binary and to move away from the before and after paradigm and make a step into a truly global art history. And I really like the idea of global art history, but I'm struggling a little bit with the proposal of disruption of the East-West and before-after divisions, particularly when speaking about the pre-1989 art. Art under communism did develop concurrently with the West rather than deriving from it, which is true, but the motives of the artists working in the East were much different to those working in the West. And this is simply given by the differing socio-political climate. The political divide did exist, and it had a direct and inevitable impact on the form that art would take in each respective environment. This fact should not be ignored and needs to be accounted for. Otherwise, there would be a danger of losing the uniqueness of each respective pole. I mentioned I like the idea of global art history, but I imagine it being connected with the contemporary post-1989 art and art theory and practice, as taking legacy from the both sides of the Cold War divide. Thus, I'm interested in what aspects or positives can be extracted from each respective side that could inform and thus enrich the contemporary theory and practice. And I am also very interested to see how such proposal could work, if it could. And we have seen quite often East European art being approached from the perspective of asking what the artists achieved despite communism and to what extent they were able to keep up with the Western developments. More recently, we have started to ask what art and artists achieved because of communism, what the unique environment of this political climate allowed them to do, rather than focusing on what kind of restrictions had to be overcome. Merging art and life would be one of these outcomes, discovering the function of art in everyday life, discovering the potential of art to heal the collective trauma which was caused by the political environment. In this respect, I really enjoyed the book by Pavlina Morganova, who is here today with us. I believe the book was titled Czech Action Art, and it inspired me a lot. Here she explains that it was exactly because of the repressive nature of communism and because of the panopticization of the society which created the identity crisis within individual citizens that the artists started to look for possibilities of transformation of life through art, something that we would hardly look for in the Western art practice. And even if we found something, then the current mainstream Western theory would make sure to explain to us that such a thing is not possible in art, that art and life do not coexist and can never do so. And yet, East European pre-1989 practice tells us opposite. So my aim is to research this phenomenon a little bit more in depth and gain better insight into the potential of art to engage in everyday life, in existential issues of an individual. I would like to investigate the main triggers that started it, the motivations and driving forces of the artist's practice to turn their attention to the man and the man's life, and the possible outcomes of their practice and their effect on the subject. And what interests me the most is whether such practice occurred uniquely and only within the given socio-political environment of communism and simply ended with the communism's fall in 1989, or whether this is something that can be sustained even beyond the geopolitical and temporal demarcations of the East-West and before-after divide. I believe that taking Julius Koller as a case study would allow me to tackle all of these questions. Through studying his vast private archive, I hope to gain more insights into the forces and factors that shaped his thinking as a neo-avant-garde artist under communism. The major concepts of his art, anti-happening and UFO, developed in the late 1960s and during the 1970s in the period of so-called normalization, in the conditions of severe oppression of culture and creative environment in the former Czechoslovakia. And both anti-happening and UFO focus on the transformation of the lived environment through personal culture, which is achieved first and foremost through the transformation of the subject, through the transformation of man into ufonaut. And this is, according to Koller, the main purpose of life and living art. He successfully pioneered this idea himself by transforming his own life into the life of ufonaut, and there you can see him in a few of his different forms. And I believe that studying Koller's archive, especially his notes from the 1970s and 1980s, commenting on societal, political, but also cultural matters, will serve as a probe into the contemporary communist society, the living conditions of an individual, the situation of the local art world, and the working conditions of an artist. Subjected to interdisciplinary research against the historical political background, they will allow better perception of totalitarian reality in which political system operates directly on everyday life of individual citizen and where private becomes political. In short, Koller's main art concepts developed in the period of post-1968 normalization in Czechoslovakia, which due to its severe and severity of complex oppression provides the most extreme case and makes it quite easy to read the trauma and its impact on the individual. Consequently, it makes it simple to read the impact of this trauma on Koller, his life, his work, which is all recorded in his personal archive. Similarly, in terms of transformation of life, Koller is against the most extreme example, as he transformed his entire life into the life of ufonaut, and every action he took in any minute of his life was the action of ufonaut and an act of personal culture, which, as he claimed, could lead to the transformation of the lived environment. Again, studying the notes in his archive would allow to pin down his thinking and give more insight into his aims. The most difficult task, perhaps, will be to answer the question of extracting the legacies and exploring whether what East European pre-1989 art achieved because of communism can be sustained even beyond the communism. This brings me to tackle the problem of the political environment and the trauma. In the context of the post-1968 normalization period Czechoslovakia, which I'm taking as my case study, Václav Havel very aptly identified the ground problem of the collective trauma in what he called the post-totalitarian system. He explains that individuals are reduced to little more than tiny cogs in an enormous mechanism, and their significance is limited to their function in this mechanism. Everything, in short, must be corseted together as firmly as possible, predetermined, regulated, and controlled. Every aberration from the prescribed course of life is treated as error, arbitrariness, and anarchy. Everyone, in all aspects of their life, is caught in this regulatory tangle of red tape, the inevitable product of the post-totalitarian system. He continues by saying that while life in its essence moves towards plurality, diversity, independent self-constitution and self-organization, in short, towards fulfillment of its own freedom, the post-totalitarian system demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. In summary, Havel identifies the ground problem of the normalized post-totalitarian Czechoslovak society, the ground problem causing the collective trauma of the lost self, as the problem of the regulated human behavior. Ironically, in this essence, normalization in Czechoslovakia was not at all unusual. Havel's description of the post-totalitarian system is identical with Michel Foucault's model of a disciplinary society that works on a principle of descending individualization. According to Foucault, this is the model on which the modern societies are based. As power becomes more anonymous and more functional, those on whom it is exercised tend to be more strongly individualized. It is exercised by the surveillance, by observation, by comparative measures that have the norm as reference. Therefore, modern society is a disciplinary society. Havel also realized this and pointed out that the system of Western democracies is not at all different from the one in the communist Czechoslovakia. It only does a better job to camouflage the fact. Thus, the period of normalization in Czechoslovakia, the originator of the collective trauma, is just another mutation of the disciplinary regime that only escalated the issue into its cosmic dimension through the extreme measures of public surveillance and regulation. Therefore, I ask the question, if the modern politics are in place to regulate the human behavior, can art help people experience the things as they truly are? Again, I think Julius Koller makes a fitting case study in this respect, since he devoted his entire life to the concept of transformation of reality through personal culture, achieved first and foremost through the transformation of the subject, through the transformation of man's life into the life of Ufonaut. So how Koller managed to transform his living environment? Traditionally, we understand the body as a social construct, which is inherently intersubjective, meaning that its signification depends on historical and social circumstances that surround it. From this point of view, the body is never complete within itself and always subject to the influence of factors of the surrounding environment. However, I believe that this intersubjectivity of body can also mean that the body is not only being influenced by the outside factors, but at the same time it is the influencer itself. In other words, traditionally it is very interesting to study the socio-political environment through its effects on the body, but it is even more interesting if this equation is turned around, and this is what we can find in Koller's practice. This allows us to examine what effects the body can have on its socio-political environment. If the body is a social construct, then in Foucauldian terms, it is a vehicle of power relations, meaning that the socio-political environment does not occur only around the body, influencing it from outside, but it occurs inside, within the body. The body thus gains the power to create, sustain, alter, and end its socio-political environment. I borrowed this idea from Michel Foucault, commenting on the Western modern society where he lived. But perhaps more fitting for the Czechoslovakian and indeed Koller's pre-1989 context would be to turn again to Václav Havel's analysis of the modern post-totalitarian society. And when we do so, we discover that Havel writes precisely the same as Foucault to address the problem of the political oppression in the normalized Czechoslovakia. He talks about the process of self-regulation, when the basic societal conflicts appears within the individual, when the man becomes not only the subject of the oppression, but also its very source, when the man becomes both the oppressor and the oppressed. Thus, if the man himself is the source of the problem, if he is the source of his own trauma, then it is him who can reverse the process by transforming his own being and consequently his own lived environment. This is also what Koller was working on, and I am planning to learn more about his ideas and his thinking by reading his research notes. Thus, the societal conflict and the very source of trauma appears within the people themselves. Consequently, if based on comparison of Foucault's and Havel's analysis of the society, the effect of the socio-political environment on the individual is essentially the same both under capitalism and communism, does it mean that the environment of the Eastern Europe, which allowed art to find its function in the struggles of everyday life, that this same environment can also be found beyond the East-West and before and after divide? Would this be one of the positive lessons that we could take from communism as alternative to capitalism? Would this be one of the possible examples that contribute to the efforts towards the reinterpretation of the currently dominant narratives concerning the theory of avant-garde? I hope to contribute to this debate by studying as a case study the work of Julius Koller and the information contained in his vast personal archive. But in summary, to put it all together again, in my research I'm planning to approach the comparison of Western and Eastern European neo-avant-garde through the framework of trauma studies. I believe that this way it will be possible to highlight and examine the key differences in outcomes of the effects the two political spectra had on art. Focusing particularly on art under communism, I aim to look at what positives can we take from communism. What was there that communism allowed artists to achieve that was not possible for art to achieve under capitalism? One of these positive aspects can be identified as the transformation of life. Consequently, I plan to examine whether these particular conditions created by communism existed only under communism, or whether we could look for something similar even today in the present post-1989 society, whether these particular qualities of East European art can be extracted to inform the contemporary theory and practice. I plan to take Julius Koller and the normalization period Czechoslovakia as the case study. Period of post-1968 normalization in Czechoslovakia created the most severe oppression of not just culture and creative sector, but particularly severe oppression of everyday life and of personal freedoms. Therefore, the trauma it left on individual, on Julius Koller in this case, can be read very easily. Also, Koller's art practice of tackling the trauma through transformation of life and through creation of personal culture that has the potential to transform the lived environment is quite easy to read and analyze through the materials in his personal archive. And thus, I believe it makes a good case study to begin with. Lastly, through the study of theories of biopolitics or body politics of Michel Foucault in more broad context and of Václav Havel in more particular context of Czechoslovakia, I aim to investigate whether there is any space for the particular and unique aspects of the East European pre-1989 art to inform the present art theory and practice. Thank you very much for your attention.